Don Bradman, the 99.94 story. He needed just 4 runs. 4 runs. That's all Don Bradman needed in the final innings of his Test career to finish with a batting average of exactly 100. One boundary, one simple shot, one final moment. But he didn't score 4. He didn't score 1. He didn't score any. Don Bradman was dismissed for 0. And instead of ending his career with the perfect number, he finished with 99.94, a number so extraordinary that more than 7 decades later, cricket fans still talk about it. But here's the bigger question. How did one batsman become so dominant that his average became one of the most famous numbers in all of sport? This is the story of the boy from rural Australia who became cricket's greatest statistical phenomenon. This is the story of Sir Donald Bradman. Welcome to the Cricket Warehouse. The boy who couldn't stop batting, Donald George Bradman, was born on the 27th of August, 1908, in Cootamundra, New South Wales, Australia. Long before the records, the crowds and the fame, Bradman was simply a young boy obsessed with cricket. He didn't just enjoy batting. He wanted to practice it constantly. One of the most famous stories from his childhood says that Bradman used a cricket ball and a water tank to practice his shots, hitting the ball as it bounced back toward him from different angles. Whether every detail of that story has survived perfectly is difficult to establish, but the important part is undeniable. Bradman practiced a lot. He developed exceptional hand-eye coordination, balance, and reactions, and he learned something that would eventually make him almost impossible to contain: how to turn opportunities into runs. By his teenage years, his talent was becoming impossible to ignore. He began playing serious cricket in New South Wales. And soon, people weren't simply talking about the young batsman. They were talking about the ridiculous number of runs he was scoring. Eventually, there was nowhere else for him to go. The highest level was waiting. His first Test, and a surprise. On the 30th of November 1928, Don Bradman made his Test debut for Australia against England in Brisbane. And this is where the story takes an interesting turn. The future legend didn't start with a masterpiece. He scored 18 inches the first innings, then just 1 inch the second. For a player who would eventually become synonymous with batting excellence, his first Test was a disappointment. But Bradman wasn't finished. In the next Test, he answered with scores of 79 and 112. The message was clear. Australia had discovered a special batsman, and England was about to find out just how special he was. The moment Bradman truly exploded onto the international stage came during Australia's 1930 Ashes tour of England. Bradman was still a young player, but he turned the series into a personal run-scoring exhibition. He scored 974 runs across the series. That remains the record for the most runs scored by a batsman in a Test series. And one innings became particularly unforgettable. At Headingley, Bradman scored 334. 334 runs. The bowlers tried different approaches. The fields changed. The pressure increased. But Bradman kept finding runs. Century, double century, triple century, eventually 334. At this point, Bradman was no longer simply a promising young batsman. He had become an international phenomenon, and the cricket world had a problem. How do you stop a batsman like this? What made Bradman so good? The answer wasn't just one thing. Bradman's technique was unusual in some ways, but it was incredibly effective. His footwork was quick, his balance was excellent, his reactions were sharp, and he had remarkable control over where he hit the ball. He didn't need to smash every delivery. He could find gaps. He could rotate the strike. He could attack when the bowler made a mistake. And perhaps most importantly, he could concentrate for extraordinarily long periods. Because batting isn't just a physical battle. It's a mental one. Every ball presents a decision. Attack, defend, leave, move forward, go back. Bradman seemed to make those decisions instinctively. Once he settled at the crease, bowlers knew they could be in for a very long day. But eventually, England found a different approach, and it became one of the most controversial strategies in cricket history. Bodyline. The 1932-33 Ashes series became famous for Bodyline. England's bowlers used short-pitch deliveries aimed at the batsman's body, while placing several fielders on the leg side. Bradman was one of the main targets. England knew something simple. If they could reduce Bradman's scoring, they could reduce Australia's chances of dominating the series. The strategy created enormous controversy. It was aggressive, it was intimidating, and it changed the nature of the Ashes battle. Bradman still produced important after retirement through his involvement in Australian cricket. But his biggest legacy wasn't a position. It wasn't a trophy. It wasn't even a record. It was his name. Bradman became a cultural icon, a name recognized even by people who never watched him play. And that is incredibly rare. Most athletes are remembered by the people who watch them. Great athletes are remembered by the next generation. But true sporting legends can be remembered by people born decades after their careers ended. Bradman became one of those legends, the perfect ending that never happened. And perhaps that is why the 99.94 story is so powerful. Imagine if Bradman had scored those 4 runs. His average would have been 100, a perfect number. People would still talk about it. But that's not what happened. Instead, he walked out needing 4, and walked back having scored 0. There was no perfect ending, no final century, no dramatic boundary, just a duck. And yet, that imperfect ending created one of the most unforgettable stories in cricket. Because sport doesn't always give us the ending we want. You can practice for years. You can dominate opponents. You can break records. You can become a legend. And then, on your final day, you can need 4 runs and score none. That's cricket. And that's sport. The legacy of 99.94. So, was Don Bradman the greatest batsman cricket has ever seen? Maybe. Maybe not. The debate will continue. Fans will choose Tendulkar. Others will choose Lara, Richards, Ponting, Kohli, Smith, or another great from another generation. And that's part of what makes cricket beautiful. There doesn't have to be one answer. But if greatness means statistical dominance, if it means consistency, if it means standing dramatically above your contemporaries, then Bradman's case is almost impossible to ignore. 52 tests. 996 runs. 29 centuries. 334 highest score. 974 runs in one Ashes series. And 99.94, a number that became a legend. A number that survived generations. A number that still makes cricket fans ask, how was that even possible? Maybe that's the real story of Don Bradman. Not that he was perfect, but that he came closer to perfection than almost anyone in cricket history. A boy from Cootamundra, a teenager obsessed with batting, a young man who conquered England, a batsman who faced Bodyline, a captain of the Invincibles, and finally, a legend who walked into his last test needing 4 runs and walked away with 99.94. He didn't get his perfect 100. He got something arguably more powerful. Immortality. This is the Cricket Warehouse, where every cricket story lives. If you enjoyed this journey through cricket history, subscribe to the Cricket Warehouse, because there are more legends, more records, more unforgettable matches, and more stories waiting to be told. The Cricket Warehouse, where every cricket story lives. Performances. But the series was difficult for Australia. England won the Ashes, and Bodyline demonstrated something that would become a recurring theme of Bradman's career. The better he became, the more desperately opponents searched for ways to stop him. Then the world changed. Bradman's career was about more than cricket. The Second World War interrupted international sport. Cricket was suspended. Players left the game, and Bradman's Test career was interrupted for years. For an athlete, losing valuable playing time during his prime could have changed everything. But Bradman eventually returned, and remarkably, he continued to perform at an extraordinary level. By now, he wasn't simply Australia's greatest batsman. He had become one of the country's biggest sporting symbols, and he was also its captain. Bradman captained Australia in 24 tests, winning 15. But his greatest team achievement was still to come. The Invincibles. In 1948, Australia travelled to England. The team included some outstanding cricketers: Keith Miller, Arthur Morris, Neil Harvey, Ray Lindwall, and, of course, their captain Don Bradman. Australia completed the entire tour undefeated. They became known as the Invincibles. For Bradman, however, there was another story unfolding. He knew his playing career was almost over. He was approaching 40 years of age. After nearly 2 decades at the highest level, the end was coming. And then came the final test. The Oval, London. August o 1948, Bradman walked onto the field for the last time as a test batsman. And this time, cricket had prepared one final twist: 4 runs. Bradman needed 4 runs to finish his test career, with an average of exactly 100. Think about that. The greatest statistical batsman of his era, standing at the crease, needing just 4 runs. One boundary would do it. But his final opponent was England's Eric Hollies. Bradman faced the delivery. And then he was out. 0. A duck. The crowd had expected another chapter in the Bradman story. Instead, they witnessed the end. No 4 runs. No average of 100. Just 99.94. And somehow, that number became even more memorable. Because it wasn't perfect. It was almost perfect. And sometimes, almost perfect is more unforgettable than perfect itself. The numbers that made history. Let's put Bradman's career into perspective. 52 test matches. 996 runs. 29 test centuries. 334 his highest test score. And 99.94 his career batting average. In first-class cricket, his numbers were even more extraordinary. He scored more than 28,000 runs and made 117 centuries. But 99.94 remains the number everyone remembers. Why? Because a batting average isn't simply about how many runs you score. It reflects how consistently you score before being dismissed. Bradman didn't merely score a huge number of runs. He scored them at a level that separated him dramatically from most of his contemporaries. And that gap is the real story. Was Bradman the greatest ever? Now comes the question that cricket fans can debate forever. Was Don Bradman the greatest batsman ever? There is no scientific way to settle it. Cricket has changed enormously. Modern players face different schedules, different equipment, different training methods, and different forms of the game. Today's stars also play Test cricket alongside ODIs, T20 internationals, and franchise cricket. Bradman played in a completely different era. So would Bradman average 99.94 inches modern cricket? Nobody knows, and anyone claiming absolute certainty is making a guess. But perhaps we should ask a different question. Not, how would Bradman perform today? But, how dominant was Bradman against the players of his own time? And that is where his case becomes extraordinary. He wasn't merely one of the best batsmen of his generation. Statistically, he was far ahead of his competition. That is why Bradman's name remains different. The legends who came after Bradman, cricket produced generation after generation of great batsmen. Sunil Gavaskar, Viv Richards, Brian Lara, Sachin Tendulkar, Ricky Ponting, Jacques Kallis, Kumar Sangakkar, Virat Kohli, Steve Smith, and many more. They created their own records. They built their own legacies. Some surpassed statistics that once belonged to Bradman. But something about Bradman's record remained special. 99.94 became a benchmark. When people talk about batting greatness, Bradman is part of the conversation. And when they hear 99.94, they know exactly what it means more than a number. But Bradman's legacy isn't only about statistics. He was a player who experienced failure. He faced enormous expectations. He lived through controversy. His career was interrupted by a world war. He returned to the game. He captained Australia. He helped lead the Invincibles. And eventually, he walked away from international cricket. His influence continued.